So hello and welcome to the New Gig podcast. I'm your host, Glen Hodgson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by the CEO of Atlas Network, Mr. Brad Lipps. How are you doing, Brad?
Real good. Thanks for having me on, Glenn.
It's an absolute pleasure. So let's just begin by just sort of going through a little bit about, liberal democracy. What's going on at the moment? How is this being challenged? And particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, what's changed and what's coming up?
Yeah, so I think that the sad truth is that illiberalism was on the rise back in 2019. I think we've seen that on the political left and the political right, making many of us who don't identify with either rather nervous about the future. And the pandemic, the dynamics of COVID-19, I think have enabled some of those illiberal tendencies to really run wild. Certainly there's a good pretext for governments amassing more power during emergencies than in normal times. The challenge is to make sure that we treat these as emergencies and that normal times resume. So I wrote this book really with the idea that we need a little bit of maybe a wake-up call to realize this is not just a global health crisis, this is a global freedom crisis.
Yeah.
And people who share this belief that free people tend to work out solutions better than top-down government mandates pan out, that we need to be going back on the offensive and fighting for our values, really standing up for the idea that you shouldn't be trying to impose one-size-fits-all solutions on businesses and on individuals and on schools, and we really need to celebrate the way that free people work out solutions through different innovations and experiments. And it's messy, but it tends to produce better outcomes. So let's not ignore those truths that have been discovered over centuries and need to be really brought to the fore now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you really hit the nail on the head there in terms of a very important point, which is, nothing's more permanent than the temporary measure. And we've seen sort of governments and authorities around the world sort of taking this opportunity to put things in place, but very little desire to remove them now as the pandemic is receding, certainly in certain places. And I think that sort of the watchword here is vigilance, and the fact that sort of it needs to be done, needs to be sort of focused, shining a light on the problems that are arising, but also pushing for freedom. Basically, most countries are sort of experiencing the same issues at the moment, Brad.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important just to come in with a balanced view of the different trade-offs. I wouldn't want anyone to think that we want to ignore that the very serious risks that are inherent in COVID-19. But I think that a single-minded focus, because this is can be a rallying cry for politicians. They know this is what they're being judged on at the moment, and I think that some of the measures they've taken to mitigate that risk have been at the expense of a tremendous number of categories of challenges that people haven't been able to navigate. The mental health issues, just sustaining the business that is crucial for their family's well-being. All these things have been sort of subjugated to one very politically potent challenge. And I think that's been really destructive. And we just need to get back into the habit of evaluating opportunity costs. That's what good economists do. Yeah. And that's what really has been missing from the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're living through this pandemic. And of course, at the same time, this increase in the use and reliance on technology. Can you say a little bit, Brad, about what the role that technology is playing here, either good or bad, within this within the freedom movement?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's really tough to come up with a blanket verdict on technology writ large. I think one of the big challenges that we have in getting people to reappreciate liberal values is that the algorithms that drive the way that we consume information these days tend not to feed us healthy information. They're sort of the junk food version of the news. And I think that we don't get measured sort of rational opinions much of the time. The media technology that we're all surrounded by tends to amplify the most discordant voices that are kind of feeding the tribalism of the moment. So there's
Yeah.
definitely problems out there, but I think it would be a big mistake not to just pause and reflect on the incredible role of technology in helping us get through these challenges. And I know that my organization is not alone in having had to really reinvent how we work together. The workplace culture has been transformed by technology. It's an amazing thing that we've been able to get through the intense challenges of the pandemic as well as we have, and that's really due to embracing new innovations and exploring new technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's, like everything, there's balance and moderation needs to be to be adopted in the approach that we're taking here as well. And I think, if we move on a little bit to look at some of the impact of these trends, and particularly on the when we look towards the labor market, Brad, what can we say about this in terms of the impact and also the repercussions as we go into the future on this?
I do think this is one of the really interesting areas. So I'm glad there's a focus of where your conversations are these days, because
Yeah,
so much is at stake. I think that one of the great things that we have seen through technology during the pandemic is an increase in labor market flexibility and
right.
companies reinventing how they can be more accommodating of the particular needs of particular employees. And this is just a wonderful evolution of how we do business and how we structure our work lives. The
Yeah.
danger, I think, is that the conceit still exists within most governments that there is always something to fix, and there's always a best way that may sound smart in the abstract, but the downstream impacts of creating a one-size-fits-all solution
Yeah.
tend to have a lot of unintended consequences.
Mm.
One of the things that we're seeing in the US, which always has had sort of a high degree of labor market flexibility
Mm.
relative to Europe, certainly, is that companies have become so much more generous in terms of accommodating family leave and the needs of
Yeah.
women after pregnancy and so on. This is happening voluntarily,
Mm.
but there is a move to impose mandates so that there's no flexibility about how companies navigate this. And I think this is just really short-sighted, and part of why women have thrived in the workplace in the US. You see many more female CEOs today than you did 20 years ago, is really because of the flexibility that's inherent there. And while
Yeah.
parts of Europe have super generous sort of mandated leave policies that people may enjoy on average, it winds up having sort of unseen effects in how people measure whether this new female hire is going to be here for the long term and how much they
Yeah.
can count on her. And that's pernicious. And then the more
Yeah.
that we let people work things out voluntarily, the better. So I think it's a really fascinating thing, because the pandemic and the technology we've embraced really enables more flexibility.
Yes.
It would be a shame if we go in the opposite direction public policy wise.
Absolutely, yeah. The public policy, the regulation needs to catch up and actually sort of realize the new paradigm in which we're working in, Brad. And I think this is the thing that, it's very simple and I wouldn't say lazy, but easier to sort of go back to the traditional way of doing things and the traditional mindset, despite the fact that the kind of genie's out of the bottle, things have moved on, and it doesn't seem to be going back anytime soon.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, one of the things that really got me interested in the ideas of freedom and how they work out was 25 years ago. I was working on Wall Street and looking at the evolution of staffing services
Right.
companies. And that they often were pilloried for providing not great jobs and so on. But when you actually looked at their profit models, it was all based on trying to make their employees become more desirable, teach them
Yeah.
skills as they were getting experience. And it seemed to me that this was a great example of how the free market incentivizes organizations, in this case, the staffing companies, to
Yeah.
help workers in a real way, Whereas, labor unions fight for benefits, but sort of at the expense of excluding others from that particular part of the
Absolutely.
labor market. And I just think more people have to look at the way that the free enterprise system tends to evolve innovative solutions we wouldn't have thought of, from a central planner perspective.
Yeah.
So we have to sort of trust that that experimentation that happens in markets really does lead to better outcomes on all sides, including for workers.
Mm, absolutely. And I think this bottom up approach, as opposed to almost a totalitarian viewpoint that, we are, as the government or a labor union, we know what's best for all workers. And, I think it's a great theme that you raise there about sort of one size doesn't fit all in almost all situations. And therefore, this flexibility is something that's needed and required. And we've got this great opportunity now that the mindsets and the technology. A wise man once said, "Never waste a good crisis." And I think that if there's one thing that could come out of this terrible pandemic, it's the sort of the openness and the flexibility which can be facilitated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should look for silver linings here, and say that we've learned a few things during the pandemic. And I think one is that sort of rigid top-down solutions tend not to work as well as the resiliency you see from your private actors in the economy. I think that you also see that there's going to be a real hunger to get economic growth moving again, and that countries in Europe should be looking to be competitive in how do you drive more openness. We don't have to agree that there's sort of a libertarian utopia out there, but I think we can look at history and say that what we learned from East and West Germany, what we learned from North and South Korea, is that if you inject a little more freedom and markets into a system, the healthier it becomes. The more you turn towards statism, you tend to poison what happens in a society. And you could probably, at the extremes, maybe there's some problems on the free market side. We can debate that, but where we are today, I think that the lesson really needs to be, let's look for ways to be more resilient, less top down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these are great themes that you touch upon in your book, Liberalism and the Free Society in 2021. So I would really like to hear a little bit more about the findings, and particularly what should governments here in Europe be doing to address these, Brad?
Yeah, well, so my book kind of takes a broad brush look at the challenges that we have coming out of the pandemic. It does introduce this new empirical tool that I worked on with a couple of other scholars called the Global Index of Economic Mentality.
Right.
And this really has as the basis that, we know through a lot of empirical research through the years that economic growth correlates pretty well with economic freedom. Well, this tool looks at whether economic mentality is tied to economic freedom. That is to say, do you need to have a broad appreciation within the population for why free enterprise tends to produce more efficient outcomes than socialism? Is that important to preserving the kinds of policies that let businesses grow and innovate? And I think that this tool is kind of interesting in showing where economic mentality is on the rise and where it's receding. One of the interesting findings is that if you look only at respondents to this worldwide survey under the age of 40 and do the analysis of which countries are the most free market in their orientation, it's countries in Eastern Europe that are leading the pack, which is a very interesting finding. I think it gives me a little hope for the future. Much of the rest of the book is really exploring through some conversations with wonderful experts I get to work with globally as we look sort of continent by continent at some of the particular challenges that are being faced coming out of the pandemic. And again, a lot of our European colleagues were focused on this great challenge of how do you just foster greater economic growth, and how do we energize people to be interested in sort of the liberal mindset at a time when it's much where sort of the tribalism of populist politics has a strong appeal.
Yeah.
And that's certainly a big challenge with many dimensions to it.
Absolutely. And I think that we've got to this stage now where by the sort of the liberalism and freedom were kind of taken for granted for so long that this was the right path. But as you say, we've come to this time now where people are questioning. There's forces which are pushing against this. So now more than ever before, it's important to stand up, realize the situation here, and maybe make these messages clearer, have more voices, showing that this is really, honestly, the only way forward in terms of development, growth, and prosperity globally.
Yeah, and one of the points that I try to make is that I think many of us who care about these sort of economic principles have made the mistake of arguing purely on terms of economic efficiency. And
Right.
what I think is really important is for us to be a little more courageous and maybe a little just more unashamed to talk about the moral vision that really animates the work that we do and the vision that we're trying to achieve, which is really all about the dignity of the individual. It's an inclusive vision. I think people often have this idea that if you are working for economic freedom, that means that you're working for people with, on behalf of people with economic means, you're serving the rich. That's not the case at all. That the reason that I've been in this game for a quarter century has been that, I understand that the people who are the most victimized by a lack of opportunity and societies where it's a political process that rewards people, the people who are most disadvantaged by that are the poor, who are kept dependent, who are not given paths out of poverty. So let's get real explicit about that, and let's stand up to the problems that we see in illiberal regimes like China that have made some moves towards markets through the years, but who now are clamping down in a really horrifying way and abusing human rights. And this should be part of our message. And I think that if we take it to a broad population that is pretty disaffected by the empty promises of the populists of the left and the right, we'll see that we're a pretty common sense crowd, us in the liberal community, and we believe in the future and the role of technology to enable more choices. And this is a hopeful vision that people should be getting on board with.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's hearts and souls as well as minds. That's the sort of the field of battle we need to be sort of playing for within the discussions, but also getting more people on board. But I think it's great that you point to this fact that the younger generation are basically tuning into this and realizing the opportunities for society, but also personally in terms of freedom, openness, and personal choice, and all these great things that so many of us have taken for granted.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. And part of what I've come to think is that in Western Europe and in the U.S., we have the luxury of living in a pretty abundant society. What people are starving for in some ways is a sense of meaning. And that the statists tend to fill that void by identifying enemies and wanting to use the political process to punish their enemies, whether that's the rich 1% or it's foreigners taking your jobs. That those are pretty appealing messages that at least appeal to a sense of I want to fight for what's right and against what's wrong. But I think they're misdiagnosing the problem. So it's really important for the liberal community to step up and reveal that we're not just technocrats looking at economic efficiency. We're also fighting for a vision of what an open society looks like. And I never in my lifetime has it been more under threat than it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to the thing as well, Brad, that people have kind of taken it for granted as this is the approach that it was taken, but slowly but surely this has been sort of clawed back, and a lot of the certainties that we had 10, 15 years ago have been called into question. So it's really important to keep making the case, spreading the message, and also underlining the importance of what's happening, but also the right approach to be taken in terms of organizing society, but giving the opportunities to individuals as well.
I think that's exactly right. You know, that there's an emerging consensus, sorry, that seems to say we're going to be less free. That's the new normal. You know, the point of this book is that that is not preordained. There are people all over the world that are working creatively to make sure that's not the case, and to make sure that the 2020s goes down as a decade which actually saw increases in human freedom.
Yeah.
So let's get active and do what we can to make that a reality.
Absolutely. And as you say, everything's in play. Nothing's decided here, but like everything in life, you need to continually be pushing for it, and exercising your right and demanding these things. And I think that your book really lays out very clearly the choices that are there, but also an ideal for living in terms of organization and what the benefits are. So fantastic for sharing your time here, Brad, but also more broadly, the fantastic work that Atlas Network is doing in bringing this to bear for individuals and societies across the globe.
Thanks so much, Glenn. It's been a pleasure to talk with you this morning.
Thank you.